If you look at some polls, it looks as though Reform are actually beating the Conservatives on a national level. But in all probability, what this will do is it will turn the dial from a Tory wipeout to an extinction level Cretaceous period event. Now, whilst there's been a good deal of controversy attached to Reform so far, I'm not going to go anywhere near that. We're going to be focusing on the economics. Reform are not my particular brand of vodka, but I think given their prominence on the UK electoral scene, it seems only right that we cover some of their policies. This is where the controversy begins, but no matter. So let's get right into it, and the first is raising the minimum income tax threshold. So what they want to do here is everybody in the UK gets £12,500 that they can earn and you won't attract any income tax. Reform want to raise this level from £12,500 to £20,000. They also want to raise the threshold for the higher income tax rate. They're proposing this will go from £50,000 to £70,000. Now, controversially, I actually don't think this is a terrible idea. The Institute for Fiscal Studies did a study, and one of the best ways of pulling low-income earners out of poverty can actually be to increase the tax-free allowance. But there's one extremely important point that we should attach to that, and that is that this is a policy that ultimately will disproportionately affect higher earners. And as you can see on this graph just here, income tax receipts are one of the biggest sources of revenue for the government. Now, Reform say that this is going to cost 70 billion a year, but the truth of the matter is other experts have placed the figure somewhere between 86 and 93 billion. So already their numbers are starting to look a little bit shaky, shall we say. And as you can see on this graph here, what you see is that the lowest earners do get some benefit, but the highest earners, those are the people who really benefit from increasing some of these thresholds. Stamp duty, but Reform basically want to triple this to £750,000. And the last time I looked at the data from memory, this is only like 4% of all properties in the UK would actually fall above this threshold. You know, the truth is, I don't necessarily disagree with this policy. I think, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that stamp duty has a really distortive effect on the housing market. If you've got someone who's retired and they're still, you know, rattling around in a 4 or 5 bed house that they've paid off decades ago, then it's understandable that they don't want to sell that house and potentially free it up for a family, because they might get lumped with a 10, 15, 20 grand stamp duty bill. So who wants to attract that? You also get these distortions in pricing. So in order to duck below some of the price thresholds, houses will grossly overvalue or grossly undervalue in order to make themselves more attractive to buyers. So stamp duty does have a distortive effect on the housing market. But there is a flip side to this coin, and that is what we invariably find is that when there's a stamp duty change, or when they make stamp duty policy slightly looser, this basically just has an inflationary pressure on house prices. You can see in this diagram here, when they had the stamp duty holiday during the peak of the coronavirus period, actually house prices just rocketed up. Now, clearly there are other variables attached to that, but there's also this kind of longitudinal study from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and basically just all these demand-side policies just juice house prices. The money that people had already set aside to go towards stamp duty just goes towards the purchase price. This does two things. It makes housing even less affordable here in the UK, but also it removes the opportunity for first-time buyers and the advantage that they have. So on balance, it's kind of a problematic policy. Now, with that in mind, we do have a very detailed video coming out about this exact topic, changes to inheritance tax. So Reform basically want to abolish inheritance tax for all estates that are under £2 million. Very quickly, the way the system works at the moment is each person gets £325,000 that they can pass on to their loved ones tax-free. So if you have a married couple, that's £650,000. Now, inheritance tax is one of the most unpopular taxes in the country, and this is true in the UK, Western Europe and the US. Now, the truth of the matter is, I think only about 4% of estates are actually liable for inheritance tax, and what this change would basically do is that mean that less than 1% of estates were liable for inheritance tax. But the truth of the matter is, this is kind of a problematic policy. Aside from the cost of £5 billion, which Reform have attached to this, it also can exacerbate social inequality. Now, I'm not keeping tabs, but the three policies that we've discussed so far, already that's 70 billion in lost revenue. So with all this money going out the door, how are Reform going to claw some of this back? Well, the first thing that they've said is that they're going to reduce government waste. Now, we should point out at this point that details on this are vanishingly thin, but they say that they are going to save £5 in every 100 in all government, across all government departments. And they say that this would save £50 billion. Now, we should point out at this point that the UK government spends about £1 trillion a year. 5% of that is their 50 billion. But this is problematic for a couple of reasons. The first is that they've said they're not going to touch pensions. They've said they're going to increase military spending to 2.5% to 3%. They've also said that they're going to hire 20,000 new police officers. And so you start to take these numbers out, and actually even if they stick by their 5% rule, this realistically is only going to save them about 30 billion. So we've talked a lot about some of the commitments that they've made, how they're going to fund them and so on, but these are some other kind of honourable mentions, some headlines if you like. They say they're going to scrap net zero, which they say will save 30 billion in a year. Number is debatable. They're going to scrap HS2, which is going to save 25 billion, also debatable. They're going to have an employer immigration tax charged at 20%, basically on national insurance, but other NI would remain at 13.8%. They're going to cut the foreign aid budget in half. They're going to do the very trendy thing, it seems, and cut down on tax evasion. So there's another interesting one in here, and that is the Treasury spends about £40 billion a year paying out interest to commercial banks in exchange for holding quantitative easing assets. And this basically compensates the Bank of England for its losses on the gilts that it had to issue. Reforms say that they're going to save about 40 billion here, but the truth of the matter is to completely scrap it would have a very destabilising effect. And when you are an economy that is largely built on services and financial services, it's it's an apple cart you don't necessarily want to upset. Some experts have said that you could potentially save maybe 5 to 10 billion. So if we were to look at this in total, what do the numbers say? Well, reforms say that their plans would cost 141 billion, but they're going to see new revenues of 150 billion. But they're also saying that all this increased economic activity would increase growth by 1%, which would give them an additional 10 billion. But the truth of the matter is, once you start to look at what Reform have estimated and what some experts have estimated, this is when you start to see the numbers start to move less in their favour, and you basically end up with a £35 billion a year black hole. And tax expert Dan Needle, who works for a bipartisan group who analyse tax affairs, said that the revenue shortfall he estimated to be around £33 billion, and he put it quite nicely, which is the equivalent to 2 Liz Trusses. What a phenomenal way of looking at this. So what do I think in conclusion? Now, this is where the controversy begins, but no matter. There are some good ideas in this policy proposal. The economist in me says that some of this stuff is worth doing, some of this stuff is worth looking at, but their ability to accurately cost this has to be thrown into question. Some of the numbers and some of the assumptions that they've used are best case, specifically increasing GDP by 1 percentage point in perpetuity because of these changes. That is a massive assumption, which, if it fails to materialise, would very start to quickly leave a black hole in the public finances. So whilst there are some good ideas here, the fact that they are completely questionably costed, I think, is a cause for real concern. And I think 2 of the really big ticket items that unfortunately we just cannot escape from are the 5% saving they say they're going to make in government departments. There is vanishingly little detail about how they would intend to do that. And as we've mentioned, once you start to take out some of their other spending commitments around pensions and defence, the truth of the matter is 50 billion is the target, but 30 billion seems more likely. And when it comes to the Bank of England reserves, again, 5, maybe 10 billion, again, decent amounts of money, but nothing like as big as they're expecting. So there are some good ideas in here, but the truth of the matter is they're largely uncosted.